Bret Weinstein is a quite popular podcaster who gained a lot of popularity by spreading COVID conspiracy theories. His podcast sits pretty high on the charts in natural sciences and sciences for several major countries. But I'm going to show in this video that he doesn't know basics about immunology. And what's better is that recently he said that if he was shown evidence and told by experts that he was wrong, that it would be uncomfortable for him, but he would change his mind. Will he keep his word? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. So a few weeks ago, someone named Megan Kelly said that her autoimmune disease was caused by COVID vaccines, and that caused Bret to, of course, comment on it because that's what these influencers do. And while commenting on it, he said this.
The fact that there is no targeting of those mRNAs so that they can land in any cell means that every time you attempt to vaccinate somebody with that technology, you are inviting an autoimmune attack on the tissue that happens to pick up the lipid nanoparticle. So if the vaccine, the so-called vaccine, stayed in your deltoid when they injected it, then the answer is, well, the cells that will be attacked by your immune system are in your arm and you can afford to lose them. Once we knew that the vaccine circulated around the body, it should be clear to anyone who understands how immunity develops that this is going to cause an autoimmune disorder in any tissue that transcribes it. And if that tissue happens to be your heart, it's going to be a devastating problem. I have just staked my reputation on a claim about how the immune system works and how the vaccine, as described by those who designed it, should work. If I'm wrong, you, Michael Shermer, are sitting here, and there should be a flood of biologists ready to explain what I've got wrong. And when that flood of biologists doesn't show up, you should ask yourself the question, why is that?
And as I mentioned earlier, he also said this.
If I am wrong about this, boy, that's not going to be a fun moment for me, but I would much rather get to the next moment where I start being right about things again than double down on an idea I'm incorrect about. That is where I'm at. So if I'm wrong about this, I'm going to have to see the evidence that I'm wrong, but I will shift my position.
So I thought, why don't I put that to the test? So I reached out to some immunologists who would be able to comment on exactly whether or not he was right or wrong and explain the science behind these topics. So I ended up getting 3 immunologists who independently submitted me video or audio clips explaining their reaction to what Bret said there. And all of the science that these experts are talking about is going to be linked in the description below so that everybody watching this, including you, Bret, can read them and see for yourself what the science actually says. So without further ado, I give you the experts.
Hi, I'm Cindy Leifer. I'm a professor of immunology at Cornell University. I'm here because we're talking about autoimmunity to viral antigens in vaccines and why that's just not true. That's not what happens. What is autoimmunity? Autoimmunity is when your body reacts against a self-antigen. The reason why that's different from a viral infection is because you can't not have a self-antigen. It's part of your body. It never goes away. This is fundamentally different than anything that's in a vaccine or anything that's associated with a viral infection. Those are foreign antigens. And yes, we develop an immune response to them, but it's temporary. We develop B cells that make antibodies and T cells that can help those B cells make antibodies, or T cells that can go kill virally infected cells. But once they do their job, almost all of them are eliminated from the body, and some are maintained as memory cells so that the next time you encounter that antigen, you can very effectively react against it. But the problem with autoimmunity is that antigen never goes away. So the antigen is always there, the immune response is always on, and therefore you've lost control of that immune response. So it's an issue of timing and control. We can't control that immune response against self-antigens effectively, and you can't ever get rid of the self-antigen, so it's a progressive chronic disease. And an immune reaction to a foreign antigen just simply is not autoimmunity. The second point is mechanism. The idea put forth for how a spike protein in a vaccine might potentially cause autoimmunity is that there's tons of the mRNA that gets into cardiomyocytes, and that causes an immune response. And then the immune cells attack those cardiomyocytes and cause the damage. There's no evidence that that happens. There's multiple ways to have or myocarditis. One of the ways is the way I just said. So if there are T cells that are reacting against a self-antigen, they can induce damage. Or there can be just general high levels of inflammatory response in that individual, and that causes immune molecules called cytokines to be circulating in the blood at high levels. And if they're in the blood at high levels, they could, in fact, damage the heart. And the third way is if there's just a predisposition. So an individual might have a particular genetic makeup that makes them simply more likely to generate this inflammatory response and more likely to incur damage to the heart, regardless of the type of stress to the body. The third point I want to make is that viral infections are actually one of the most common underlying mechanisms for myocarditis. It's not a vaccine, it's the actual viral infection, because some viruses infect the heart cells. That's their target cell type. And in that case, yes, the immune system aggressively attacks those infected cells. Now, myocarditis can happen with SARS-CoV-2 infection as well, or COVID-19. In that case, the myocarditis is more severe, more long-lasting, and 10 times more frequent than if you have the very rare mild form of myocarditis in response to a vaccine. So what do we take away from this? One, there's no evidence that there's this massive immune response against the heart cells by the immune system following a vaccine. Two, that is not autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is to antigens that can't go away. They're part of your body. It's a chronic immune response that's not controlled. And third, virus infection itself can cause myocarditis, and it's much more severe, long-lasting, and debilitating than anything you might see with a vaccine. Why is all this important? Because the only ways that we can prevent ourselves from getting infected with viruses are from preventing exposure, and that's wearing masks all the time, and even that's not 100% effective. So we need to protect ourselves against viruses. We have very few treatments for viruses, so the best way to protect yourself against virus infections is to be vaccinated or immunized. And there's no doubt that the vaccine is safe and effective, and it is much better to get the vaccine, much lower risk of disease, much lower risk of myocarditis than with getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 and getting COVID-19.
I've just been listening to Bret Weinstein linking the COVID RNA vaccines with autoimmunity. He starts off saying that the cells that transcribe the RNA message will be inherently attacked by T cells, whose function it is to destroy virally infected cells. There are a few mistakes in here. One is a technical one, that it is RNA and not DNA, so we are talking about translation and not transcription. I think that's a minor point. I think what's important here is to understand that our T cells are really trained to only respond against foreign peptides, that is, pieces of protein. And indeed, once those peptides are detected on the surface of cells, these cells will be killed. Exactly the same thing as a virus that is detected inside an infected cell. Also, that cell is killed. And indeed, the RNA vaccines mimic this process of a viral infection very well. The second part is he then calls it so-called vaccines, which is a bit confusing. I think it's very clear from countless studies, scientists, labs in many, many countries. These vaccines ensure very good selection and activation of B cells and T cells, They produce very good antibodies, and hence this is a very good working vaccine. It does exactly what a vaccine is supposed to do. It protects us against severe disease. It is indeed correct that when the vaccine is injected in the muscle, there will be muscle cells that take up the RNA. The RNA will be translated into spike protein, and those cells that express this on their surface will indeed be killed by T cells. The muscle is actually a good example of how this happens. Upon injury, for example, after an infection, those cells will be replaced once they are damaged. The muscle itself holds many stem cells that will replace any infected or spike-producing cell that is killed by your T cells. What is not true is that the vaccine is circulating around the body. This is a misconception. The vaccine does not circulate. It was hard enough to generate it, so it would last long enough to be taken up by a few cells in your muscle. It is also stored at very low temperatures because otherwise it might fall apart. The vaccine or any other vaccine does not circulate. Studies have actually shown that about 90% of the vaccine content is at the place of injection, with about 10% in the liver. In both places, it is broken down very quickly. This is really a matter of a few days. You might find pieces, such as the lipid nanoparticles or fragments of RNA, but these are at very low amounts and they do not make a functional vaccine. So it's important to understand this misconception. Bret goes on to say that it should be clear to anyone who understands how immunity develops that this is going to cause an autoimmune disorder in any tissue that transcribes. I think he again means translates. But this is a misconception that is mixed with a lack of knowledge to make a pretty scary story. Autoimmune disorders, as the name implies, are immune reactions against self. Immune reactions from the vaccine are actually against a foreign or non-self protein called spike. Even in the worst case, if a whole or functional vaccine would end up in a cell far away from the muscle, also this cell will just be replaced. To make it extra scary, the heart is given as an example, possibly linking it with myocarditis. But the latter is actually a consequence of inflammation itself, primarily due to soluble immune mediators called cytokines, of which the concentration is actually much higher upon viral infection. And yes, also in your heart muscle, there are stem cells that will be replaced if the cell is killed. So in summary, the statements are pretty wrong. The central point of vaccine distribution is wrong. The more importantly, there is a complete misunderstanding of how the immune system discriminates between self and non-self. This is the quintessential principle of immunology and how it works with surgical precision. This goes back to the days of Frank McFarlane Burnett, who introduced self into the immunological lexicon in 1949. The mechanistic working of this has been worked out by Peter Medawar, Jacques Miller, Charlie Janeway, Rolf Sinkernagel, and of course Peter Doherty. This really is the quintessential part of immunology.
So firstly, what Weinstein says is that there's no targeting on the mRNA for a specific cell type is not entirely correct. What is true is that unlike with viruses, which you can kind of take mRNA vaccines to be vaguely modeled on, there's no cellular receptor for the mRNA vaccine to direct the uptake. But that doesn't mean that uptake is random and we have no idea where it occurs. We know in great detail where mRNA vaccines end up being taken up. We know that they're taken up overwhelmingly at the injection site by both the muscle cells and the dendritic cells, and that is predominantly where they stay. The dendritic cells are a type of white blood cell that tends to be particularly good at activating T cells and initiating the immune response. And once it's activated, that dendritic cell will go to the nearest lymph node with the T cells that can respond to spike protein. As it produces spike protein, B cells that can recognize the spike protein will be produced, and that will give rise to the germinal center reaction that the mRNA vaccines are so well known for. Now, at one point, quite early on, Weinstein claims that the vaccine itself circulates widely, and presumably he's referring to humans because that would be the relevant context here. And this comment belies a serious misunderstanding. It's based on the pharmacokinetic data that was submitted by the manufacturers of the mRNA vaccines pre-licensure. And in this study, basically what they do is they take the lipid nanoparticle that the mRNA vaccines are in, but instead of putting the mRNA from the vaccine in them, they put in this enzyme called luciferase. So why do they do this? Luciferase is a really beloved tool in molecular biology. It's actually the enzyme that enables fireflies to glow, and Lucifer actually means light bringer. Basically, when luciferase is in the presence of the metabolite luciferin, it will generate light. when you do this, where you put the luciferase mRNA in the lipid nanoparticles and inject them into the rats, you can then sample the tissues from the rats after you sacrifice them, which is the polite euphemism we use for, killing laboratory animals, so that we can interrogate what's happening to them physiologically, pathophysiologically, and so on. You can get a readout in numbers of how much vaccine expression there is, how much mRNA expression there is by the amount of light that you generate with the luciferase, right? So this is really, really convenient. So when you do this with the rats, you give them a dose that is equivalent to 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight of the rat. What's the problem here? The problem here is that before we even consider metabolism here, if you adjust for the weight of the rat and compare it to the weight of the person, you are, if you take a 40 kilogram human, which is like the average size of a 12-year-old girl on the WHO growth chart, this is roughly equivalent to getting 1,400 doses of the mRNA vaccine at the same time, which is not a thing that anyone is doing, and not a thing that anyone should do, and not a thing that anyone recommends you do. In these circumstances, it's not unusual that you would see much wider distribution of the mRNA vaccine than what you would expect to see at the doses that are used in the physiologically relevant context, right? What we also see, though, from these preclinical studies is that the luciferase signal, the vast majority of it, is coming from the injection site and from the draining lymph nodes, which is exactly what we would expect. It is not impossible necessarily that you do get some degree of vascular leak and you do get some wide distribution, but fundamentally, this is not some vaccine that's like going directly into the bloodstream, going willy-nilly everywhere, into the brain, into the heart, what have you, like Weinstein is attempting to suggest. It's not. Overwhelmingly, it's going to be in the injection site and the lymph nodes that drain the injection site. It's overwhelmingly going to go into dendritic cells, and it's going to go into muscle cells, and those are the cells that are going to express the spike protein. It's really not that complicated. In contrast to the virus, to SARS-CoV-2, in which we can see a massive autoimmune signature similar to what we see with the autoimmune disease lupus, in which there are global defects in our ability to tolerate self. We have nothing resembling that with mRNA vaccines. Studies have profiled the development of autoantibodies, that's antibodies against our own self-antigens, against before and after mRNA vaccination, including in patients with myocarditis, which is a point I will return to in a moment. And there is nothing resembling an autoimmune signature there. They provide us with the benefits of immunity against the spike protein without the risk of developing autoimmunity and autoimmune disease that we see with SARS-CoV-2. And we furthermore, you can see that among those who develop breakthrough infections, that risk of autoimmune disease following SARS-CoV-2 is attenuated. Now, at one point, Weinstein alludes to this idea, not explicitly, but he suggests that myocarditis following the mRNA vaccines reflects an autoimmune phenomenon. And this is not well supported. The latest evidence that we have suggests that there's an overreaction on the part of the immune system to the vaccine that causes it to make too many cytokines in response to it at too high levels, which manifests as the transient myocarditis that generally self-limits and self-resolves relatively quickly. However, what we don't see is any kind of autoimmune signature where there are antibodies targeting the heart or there is T cells targeting the heart. That is simply not observed. That has been looked at extensively. It isn't clearly there. The idea that you can just cause an autoimmune disease to sprout out of nowhere by vaccination demonstrates a substantial and fundamental lack of understanding of how the immune system works. Even in individuals who have existing autoimmune disease, first of all, it is not recommended that they avoid vaccination, mRNA vaccination, or what have you, even if they are on immunosuppressants. The American College of Rheumatology has posted detailed guidelines in ensuring that these people can benefit from the protection of vaccination, including for them to stop immunosuppressive medications for a period and how to stop them and under what circumstances to ensure that they can benefit from the protection of vaccine as much as possible. But beyond that, even among patients with active autoimmune disease, we don't see uniformly that they develop flares. In some cases, there is no increased risk of flares in some study. In other studies, there tends to be a small but real increased risk of flares, and it generally resolves on its own. But in any case, there is not anything resembling like a clear autoimmune signature. There is nothing here that suggests that the mRNA vaccines are meaningfully increasing the risk of developing an autoimmune disease. I will conclude by pointing out that Weinstein really overestimates his own importance in thinking that his ignorance warrants a flood of biologists responding to explain where he got things wrong. But insofar as he staked his reputation on this, I will expect him to be silent forevermore on the issues of vaccination, in particular vaccination against COVID-19, given that he is so egregiously wrong.
Well, there you have it. The experts have spoken, and Bret is just wrong. So, Bret, will you change your mind? Will you be a man of your word and admit that you're wrong and that you don't know what you're talking about here? We'll find out. Well, that's going to be it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. As always, I really appreciate you watching, and don't forget to check out the links in the description. It contains all of the science that was talked about in this video, so you can check that out for yourself. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me next week, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.
Dr. Wilson,